everyone to our electronic all councils meeting on April 29th, 2022. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, councils are practicing physical distancing. I am president in regional chambers along with my colleague, Councillor Shantz. Others are participating electronically. I would like to acknowledge the land on which we gather virtually today is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We acknowledge the enduring presence of these Indigenous people with whom we share this land today, their achievements, and their contributions to our community. I'm pleased that we have been able to gather to give everyone the opportunity to hear thoughts on how and where our region could potentially grow over the next 30 years. We are at a critical stage of the update to our regional official plan, where we are reaching out to the community to seek their thoughts on some growth options related to the forecasted population and employment. So I just would reiterate that this is a public meeting. We are being live streamed, but the public will have future opportunities to weigh in and participate and give their input. We're also working very closely with staff from each area municipality to hear about specific concerns, ideas around vision and growth, and trying to get a real understanding of priorities. We have a full group of people on deck today who are here not only of the Can people hear me?
No, not very clearly.
Okay.
Lots of static.
I think someone is not muted their line, Chair Redmond, so maybe everyone can just double check that they're all muted.
Okay, if everybody else could mute their line, that would be helpful.
We're just testing some audio here. No more static?
Yes, the static is still there. And I see that some people are still not muted.
Any better with the static?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Much better.
Much
Okay.
better, yeah.
So colleagues, how much did you hear? Do I start at the beginning or I do continue on?
Continue on.
Okay. So as I said, we are live streaming. This is a public meeting, and we're working very closely with staff from each area municipality to hear about specific concerns, ideas around vision and growth, and trying to get a real understanding of priorities. We have a full group of people on deck today who are here not only to help explain the complexities around updating the regional official plan, but how the work on the land needs assessment fits into this, as well as some of the policy development work that you may have heard about, but also some of the implications of growth options for your particular area or municipality. The purpose of today is intended to be an educational session, provide answers to questions of clarification. It is not the intention of today to debate options or to direct staff. I'll now call on Rod Regier to provide an overview of the regional official plan process and introduce our guest speaker, Steve Pomeroy. We're very happy to have Steve join us today, and I will hand the mic over to Rod. Welcome, Rod.
Thank you, Chair Redmond. Maybe I should just do a little audio check. Can people hear me appropriately? Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us all today. We're very pleased to have you all with us, and we've been thinking a lot about the best way to present to you some of the information that will not only help us understand how a regional official plan and its component parts fit together, but also to provide you with enough information on how this process affects your community and your municipality. We'd like you to leave this session feeling as though you've had an opportunity to hear about some of the bigger issues that are facing our region in the next 30 years, why we're doing what we're doing, and also that you've had an opportunity to ask questions and get some answers. As you're aware, the Waterloo region is one of the fastest growing municipalities in Canada. We are forecasted to welcome 300,000 more residents and approximately 168,000 jobs between now and the year 2051. We are right in the middle of our public engagement process on the growth options for this region. And we look forward to working together with you, the municipalities you represent, and community members to help Waterloo region reach its full potential. Before we get into the presentations, I'd like to introduce you to the team working on this project. From Dillon Consulting, we have Patty Kennedy and Justine Giancola. And from Watson Associates, we have Jamie Cook joining us. From the region, we have Danielle DeFields, Brenna McKinnon, and Ryan Pogresba. We will all be able to answer any questions of clarification that you may have throughout the afternoon. Next slide, please. So for today, we'll first go over doing a regional official plan review and what that means in terms of being ready for the next 30 years. This will lead us into a review of our collective community vision and what ultimately we're trying to achieve with this work. And then I'm delighted to hand over part of the afternoon to Steve Pomeroy, who will really give us some food for thought and challenge the way that we're thinking about housing, both from a supply and a demand perspective. The evidence-based work that he is doing, and he'll speak to us today about ties in nicely to the ROP review and the growth options that we are considering. After a question and answers period with Steve, we'll dive into the growth options and hopefully give you a better understanding of how and where we'll grow, and could potentially how and where growth could potentially occur in the future. Next slide, please. Achieving our vision. As we continue to work together with area municipal staff on updating the regional official plan, this brings up the question around why we're doing this. How does this help us achieve our collective vision for the Waterloo region? Next slide. Let's start with why we are updating the regional official plan. Well, the region is growing. We're one of the 3 fastest growing communities in Canada. We receive forecasts from the province that indicate that we will be welcoming about 300,000 more people and 168,000 jobs to this region over the next 30 years. We need to be ready for this growth, which is why we are planning for such a long time in advance. Next slide. Now, let's spend a moment on vision. Our community vision is Waterloo region will be an inclusive, thriving, and sustainable region of connected urban and rural communities with global reach, fostering opportunities for current and future generations. Our vision stems from community visioning exercises conducted through the Regional Growth Management Strategy process, our strategic planning processes, and subsequent conversations and feedback from the community. It sets the tone for continuing our strong reputation for managing future growth in a responsible manner while preserving the things that matter for future generations. Next slide, please. The Regional Official Plan is a powerful planning tool that shapes and defines our community for generations. It has guided the decision-making for profound transformation of this region, including, for example, the addition of ion light rail transit and the rapid urban intensification that is now underway. Ongoing protection of agricultural lands and the natural environment with the objective of maintaining high quality of life for residents. This particular Regional Official Plan review focuses on providing a strong, thoughtful, and realistic approach to land use planning and the decisions that must be made in order to ensure that Waterloo region continues to be a world-class place to live, work, and play. The ROP's priorities start with continuing to build an equitable, thriving, and sustainable region. It takes an intensification first approach to growth management. This plan aims to be transformational, particularly as we continue to face the challenges associated with climate change. We need to make some very significant changes in the way that we build and live. The plan will work to advance Indigenous relationships and reconciliation, both through policy and in the development of the amendment. It also focuses on using our land and water in an efficient way to provide for long-term protection of these resources. The ROP themes that are linked to these priorities drill down a little further into what our objectives are with respect to achieving our vision. Equity, which relates to having a community where every person feels safe, valued, and cared for, as well as working towards reconciliation, anti-racism, anti-oppression, and systemic change. Thriving and livable communities is the second theme, which speaks to fiscal responsibility, having a varied and robust culture, modern and efficient infrastructure, all towards the goal of being a world-class community. The third theme is ability, which captures the ideas around climate action, being stewards of the natural environment, supporting a culture of conservation and protecting agricultural lands. Many of the big decisions that Council has made in terms of implementing our current Regional Official Plan relate to the policies that are contained in this document. For example, the policies that around transit supportive development have had a direct influence on achieving this community vision, particularly through the construction of ION. And the upcoming decisions on growth options will continue to affect how we shape the future of the region. Next slide, please. So how did we get here today? This slide highlights that we started this update for the Regional Official Plan in the fall of 2019, and there's been a lot of behind-the-scenes work and analysis to get to where we are, which is the discussion around growth options. So starting in the fall of 2019, we have engaged through our online platform, Engage WR. This has included releasing all of our technical and council reports, conducting engagement surveys, presenting draft policies for feedback, and also providing interactive mapping and holding webinars. Through this process, we've also had the opportunity to work collaboratively with each area municipality, so that we are not only working towards meeting regional council's policy objectives, but also aligning with the area municipal interests and objectives. We have met with planning staff and CAOs to discuss the land needs assessment in a separate group, in a group setting. And also we've had the chance to meet with staff at each of the area municipalities separately to walk through the LNA results for their community and look forward to continuing the conversation and gathering further input as we move forward in this process. In addition, we've engaged with our regional official plan review committees, such as the technical team, our stakeholder committee, and our steering committee. Next slide, please. Next, we will shift to how we plan to work towards adoption of the regional official plan amendment in August and beyond. On the top of the screen in bolded text, you will see whether each step is a decision point of regional council or an opportunity to listen and receive input from staff, stakeholders, or members of the public. I'll walk you through the dates on the screen starting today, which is the release of the draft land needs assessment, as well as the start of our 6-week public engagement period on it. On May 18th, we have scheduled a special public input meeting where members of the community will have an opportunity to provide their thoughts, opinions, and feedback on the draft land needs assessment and growth options. After that, we have identified May 27th as the feedback deadline for the draft LNA and growth options. Most area municipalities have indicated that there's enough time to provide a response on the growth options prior to the recommendation report from regional staff. And we'll be working very closely with your area municipal staff over the next 4 weeks to fine tune the information in this analysis. That recommendation report on the preferred option will come on June 15th, in addition to a second information report on the release of the draft regional official plan amendment. This report will be focused on the growth-related policies and mapping. Then we will be moving into the summer months, targeting adoption of the amendment in August. This process will also have public engagement sessions and a statutory public meeting. Do we have any questions at this stage in the conversation? I don't see everybody on my screen, so perhaps somebody can flag for me whether there's any hands are going up.
So
Councillor Kiefer.
Okay, Rod, I do see one hand, and I would just ask people to please use your icons to raise your hand. I have a board and I can see everybody. So, Councillor Kiefer, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Rod, I was wondering if there's any concern about the summer months in terms of meetings when people are on vacation and holidays, if that's going to be a complication.
Well, certainly, Councillor Kiefer, the summer is not an ideal time to do public consultations. I would say that the opportunity to participate through online forums and including our Engage WR platform are, significantly improve the accessibility of the process. We will be making the process available for the statutory public meeting as well. And so I'm confident that if people are interested in participating in this process, that they'll have ample opportunity. But having said that, it would have been ideal to do this in the middle of winter or in a shoulder season.
Thank you.
I see no other hands, Rod, so please feel free to go ahead.
Great. So this brings us to our first transition point in the afternoon, where I'd like to open the floor. Oh, sorry. Slide 10, please. It's not often that we get to meet with all of you in one room. And beyond that, it's also not often that we have the pleasure to welcome a guest speaker. Today's guest is Steve Pomeroy, who's an Ottawa-based housing research consultant and part-time lecturer at Carleton and McMaster. Widely recognized as one of the leading housing experts and thought leaders in Canada, Steve has almost 40 years of experience in the housing sector. Initially in the nonprofit sector, local government, and with CMHC, before establishing Focus House Consulting in 1994. Since then, he has completed over 220 research reports covering all aspects of housing, including needs analysis, comprehensive housing strategies, and financial feasibility, as well as urban issues in Canada and internationally. Steve regularly advises a number of national, provincial housing associations, many municipalities and provinces, and is an advisor to the newly created Federal Housing Advocate. He is also a frequent commentator on housing issues in various national and local media, but just in case you're about to search your social media feeds, he doesn't tweet. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Rod. Yes, everyone can hear me okay? So as Rod indicated, I was asked to speak about housing. I mean, I realize you're speaking more generally about the growth strategy for the region. Obviously, growth associated with accommodating more households. And so housing supply is a very integral part of that growth strategy. I'm going to sort of talk not so much about sort of the growth part of it, but really the affordability side of housing and some of the issues that have been raised recently in that particular area. Next slide. You can't open up a national newspaper or even a local newspaper for that matter these days without seeing an article around housing affordability. And that's articulated in the Housing Summit back in January that some of you, I suspect, may have attended. The Premier identified the fact that we have a housing affordability crisis. But much of the dialogue around this so-called crisis has really focused on the fact that we have the cause of high prices is an insufficient supply. And ergo, if we simply add more supply, we will correct and address the issue of the affordability of housing. I would, I guess, self-describe myself as a supply skeptic in that regard. I think supply is critically important for growth. I think using supply as a mechanism to address affordability, I don't think it will get us very far, and I'll explain why as I go through a number of charts. This really started back in the spring of 2020 when Scotia Economics, Jean-Francois Perrault, the chief economist, put out a report where he compared Canada to the rest of the G7 and noted that Canada has the fewest homes per capita in the G7. I've subsequently done a number of charts where I've actually identified that Canada has the most people in every house in the G7, except for the US. So the fact that we have fewer homes, I mean, using the G7 as a comparable isn't a very robust way to assess what our housing needs are. Using more detailed local demographic analysis, the kind of stuff that Watson and others are doing for you, is a much more appropriate way to determine, do we in fact, what is the level of supply that we need. Subsequent to that particular report, we saw both the census data came out in February, and looking at the growth of number of households, looking at the number of household starts, we actually can confirm that the production of housing in this country, both nationally, provincially, and in your region, has in fact kept up with household growth. So this notion that we have this massive undersupply, as it was articulated this morning in an editorial of the Globe and Mail, the housing supply myth is indeed a myth. And I'm going to discuss the evidence to prove that's the case. Next slide. So when we talk about housing affordability and what causes prices to increase, the fundamentals of housing and housing affordability relate to both the quantity of supply versus demand, which really is looking at population growth and how that translates into household growth and where those people go. And secondly, the capacity of those folks to actually purchase and consume housing in terms of their income, the cost of money, mortgage rates, because housing is a highly leveraged asset. We don't buy housing with cash in most cases. And also the degree to which folks can accumulate equity or down payments towards that particular purchase. Next slide. So if we go on the population side, this notion that we have this massive growth certainly is a very recent phenomenon, both nationally and provincially. We were bouncing along quite steadily for about 15 years, 350,000 folks a year, more or less, nationally, about 110, 120 provincially. And then all of a sudden we got to 2016, 17, and we see this massive increase and very short-term surge in growth. People can get on a plane today and arrive tomorrow, or even later on today, depending where they're coming from. We can't produce housing in a day. It takes, as you very well know, 2 or 3 years. So there's always going to be housing, as economists would define it. It's inherently supply inelastic. It doesn't respond to short-term signals. It just simply can't. So you do actually have short-term pressures on housing markets. You hopefully eventually catch up and try to level those out. If we go to the next slide, we can see the reasons for this, or what was sort of happening there in 2017-18. If we look at the components of population growth grows from natural growth, births and deaths, which we see that slowing down, and one of the consequences, we saw the census data yesterday in terms of an aging population. As the baby boom enters the era of its mortality, we have more deaths than we have births. And therefore we see that line going down, which is actually a good thing for the housing market, because every time a single senior that's rattling around in a 3 or 4 bedroom house passes on, they leave a house that can accommodate 4 people. So in some respects, grandma can actually solve the housing supply crisis for us. The red section is international migration. The thing that really stands out on this chart is the green bars in 2017-18. And this is what Statistics Canada defines as non-permanent residents. These would be temporary foreign workers, so folks working in the agrarian industries and in the resource industries, which in most cases they're housed in bunkhouses and therefore don't create housing demand. But the vast majority of this group are international students, foreign students. It's a result of the underfunding of post-secondary education. Many universities have basically tried to find new sources of revenue, the most lucrative version of which is to attract foreign students. And we've seen very substantial increases in the number of students in our universities, which has really driven this up. And of course, coming in as foreign students, the type of demand these folks will have is going to be more in the rental part of the market rather than the home ownership part of the market. Next slide. We see this particularly in Waterloo region. You're obviously a region with a number of large educational institutions, and you saw a more dramatic bump up in that particular growth after about 2016-17 than a lot of other places did. Obviously, at the national level, immigration is all international. At the provincial and local level, we also add in inter and intra-provincial migration as well, which has an effect. But as you can see here, really the most growth in your region is international, and most particularly these non-permanent residents, or as I suggested in your case, are probably predominantly international students. And to the implications for your sort of the type of housing you're building, as I suggested, this is going to impact more on the rental side of the market than it will on the home side, and therefore on rents more so than it will on prices. And we'll come back and look at the level of rents a little bit later. Next slide. So in terms of this notion, we have an undersupply problem. How have we actually responded? We saw that surge in population. It took a while to ramp things up, but we've essentially did. And we had a significant increase in new housing starts in 2021, provincially up 40% from the previous decade. And in your region, the Kitchener-Waterloo region, up by 58% over the previous decade. So there has, in many respects, the industry has responded. The municipalities have been successful in substantially accelerating their approvals of building permits, and the builders have been able to build more housing. So this notion, and certainly I think the unfair accusations that the problem first the problem is supply, which I disagree with, obviously, and the fact that the supply issue is caused by the tardiness and slowness and onerousness of municipal approval processes. It turns out in 2021, everybody upped their game, and we seem to have addressed that reasonably nicely. I mean, I suspect there is room to improve the process to some extent, but the notion we have to substantially change things, I think, is erroneous. And certainly the suggestion in the last federal budget that we need nationally to be adding 350,000 homes per year, again, I think is exceptionally inflated relative if we look at the actual level of growth. The budget predicted that we will be bringing in 451,000 new permanent residents a year. We saw natural growth in that earlier chart going down substantially. If you add those two things together, you get population growth of around about 550,000 people a year, which translates to housing requirements of around about 220,000 to 240,000 a year nationally. That's above the 190,000 we've been building for the last decade across the country, but it's well below the 277,000 that we built last year. So I think we've already got to a level that's probably sufficient in terms of meeting growth at a national level. How that sorts itself out across the country, and as the mayor indicated earlier, your region is one of the fastest growing in the country, growing by 9.9% between the 2016 and 21 census. Obviously, you are going to be a recipient of a large number of a large portion of that population growth, and therefore it's appropriate to think quite carefully through that. Next slide. But just to bring these two things together in terms of population growth and starts, what this chart is showing us is the number of starts for every new 1,000 people there are in the population. And essentially what we have seen is sort of a slight downward trend here over time, but that's only because we were building massively way more homes than we needed in the early part of the millennium, roughly 700 or 800 homes for every 1,000 people. That's almost a home for every person. Whereas we typically put 2.5 or 2.4 people in each house. That was clearly more than we needed. It has come down, and we've seen Ontario has not done as well as the rest of the country, and particularly in that 2017-19 period. Ontario had far fewer starts per 1,000, which is cause of the consternation around this undersupply, but we've seen that come back up again, mainly because we closed the borders in 2020, and we've had fewer people come in. This dip in 2017-19 is not because we were building less housing, it's because we were getting this surge of more in, which we saw in the earlier slide. Next chart. So that's the supply side of the issue. And now we'll go back to the demand factors: incomes, borrowing capacity, and down payments. I see a couple of hands here. I presume, are we waiting to the end for questions?
So, Steve, I see one here.
Is that the intent?
Councillor Singh, would you like to ask a question at this juncture?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I can wait till the end if you like. I just, as the presenter was outlining issue of supply, they made a point regarding the increasing demand from student residency, and the comment made was that more so affects the rental market, not necessarily about housing ownership affordability, but the fact that those units are being displaced towards rental and towards increasing rental market from those students, that does take and restrict supply all around. So the point the presenter was making seemed contrary, and I wanted a little bit of an explanation on that, but again, that answer can wait till the end. Thank you.
Okay, I'll come back to that later. And certainly, yeah, you are right. I mean, those international students do have an effect in displacing folks in the rental market, and certainly from a supply point of view, the easiest way to address that issue, rather than trying to build deeply affordable housing for those folks being displaced, is to actually expand your supply of purpose-built student housing, which I think you do generally quite a good job in the Waterloo region. You've got a lot of private investors that are actually creating purpose-built student housing, which takes the pressure off the rest of the low-end rental market, perhaps more so than it does in other jurisdictions. So jumping to the next slide, on the demand side factors that are really, and this is what I think is really the cause of increasing home prices. What we've seen over the last 15 years is a pretty steady increase in incomes, where income's increasing by about 30% from $70,000 to $104,000. This is household income. Median household income across the country. And at the same time, as we all know, a very substantial decline in mortgage interest rates. And what's really important, people don't, as I mentioned before, you don't buy homes with cash. You buy it you finance it and generally take out a mortgage of 75 to 95% of the cost of the home. So as interest rates go down, the impact of every dollar of income is significantly impacted by the leverage effect of declining and now very low, or at least they were. They're now starting to turn around, and to some extent, I suspect that will actually have some impact on house price increases as we go forward. Next slide. We see quite often as people talk about the price to income ratio and the fact that prices are going up dramatically faster than the rate of increase in incomes. Yes, that's true, but the price to income ratio is a very poor indicator and a very poor measure of housing affordability because of the interest rate effect that I just mentioned. Next slide. Which we can see here, if we take in for each year the prevailing mortgage rate and the household income in that particular year, how much mortgage can they borrow? The gray line is their purchasing capacity. The orange line is the median composite home price across the country. And until last year, we can see that what people can actually afford and what they can demand is actually significantly above the actual median home price. So it's the fact that folks have that capacity, they're pulling prices up. It's not that they're falling behind where the prices are. We did see that line finally cross over last year, and it did get to an effect where we can no longer really afford just on the income side and the interest rate side housing. But that's where the other factor comes in, which is accumulated wealth. Next slide. What we've seen, as house prices went up, and we've all seen the financial papers and literature or journal articles, that home prices typically went up around about 30% last year, more or less 50% in the last 2 years. So doubling of home prices. Over the last decade, what we've seen is the level of aggregate total mortgage debt held by Canadian households increased by 300 it more or less doubled over the decade, and in the last 2 years alone increased by $302 billion. At the same time, because of the increase in home prices, the equity that we actually have in our homes has increased 8 times as fast. $2.4 trillion increase just in the last 2 years. So basically, as people have slept in their beds at night, their house is earning more than they are by going to work. We have this incredible buildup of home-based equity and wealth that's a very significant factor in terms of the housing market, because most folks that are buying are these folks that already have a house and are based on that existing equity. So the fact that their capacity to pay, we saw on the previous chart, had just crossed over, that's significantly offset by the fact that they're not taking out as big a mortgages, actually use a much bigger down payment enabled by their accumulated wealth. Next slide. And the other factor here is that there are very few of us that are actually active in the housing market. We've got 16 million homes in Canada, 10.4 of them are owner occupied. The other almost 5 million are renters. Every year, it went up a little bit last year, but give or take, 550 to 600,000 existing homes are sold. And new homes only account for about 150,000 of the homes that are sold each year, so about a quarter. So most of the market is in the existing market of people basically selling their existing house or buying an existing house. And if we look at that as a number, it's only about 5% of all households are actually active, and it tends to be the ones with better incomes and the folks who have this accumulated wealth that they can bring to the marketplace. And they're the ones that are really driving up these home prices. Is very much consumer-led, and the collateral damage in that are the folks with less capacity to pay, the folks who have not yet been in the market, don't have that equity accumulation, and the young families that are just sort of starting out, some of them may have reasonably good jobs, particularly those in the professional fields, and in your area, in the high-tech area, down payment is a bit more of a challenge, and they need to spend a few more years saving up. And meanwhile, the prices are getting away from them. Next slide. So really, it's this, the combination of these demand side factors: declining interest rates, accumulated equity, the fact that 3/4 of people buying a home already own one. A number of those actually are buying a second home as an investment. So the investment part of the market has been highlighted recently as a significant factor as well. And again, they are significantly enhanced by the accumulation of wealth in the home that they previously or currently own. And it's really this whole notion of sort of price appreciation and windfall gain has really created this phenomenon of supercharged demand, this capacity to pay, even if interest rates go up a couple of 3% in the next year. These folks with all kinds of equity won't really be significantly affected by that because they're not buying with large mortgage debt, they're buying with a lot of cash. In many cases, some of them are actually cashing out and downsizing, maybe equity or down payment assistance to their kids that are helping younger families who happen to have the right parents and whose parents have ridden the wave of appreciation are helping them out. So that's some sort of intergenerational wealth transfer effect. But it's really this supercharged demand is really what has been driving up home prices. And it's a very, very serious challenge for governments to address, given that the only way to really address it is to confiscate some of that windfall gain, which means taxing home prices, which is politically obviously not very attractive when 2/3 of voters are homeowners. And the minister has indeed drawn a line in the sand and said that this government will not tax capital gains. Personally, I don't think it has to be a change to the capital gains tax. I think we could put a levy, an affordability levy on home sales. We already have land transfer taxes that the province are collecting revenues from. It wouldn't be difficult to do it at the federal level. And the irony in terms of the provincial land transfer tax is that as these folks that are selling these massively appreciated homes are walking away with bags of money, the folks that are trying to buy them, the first-time buyers, are the ones that actually, having struggled to put together a down payment to buy the house, also get slapped with having to pay the land transfer tax. Why we don't move the land transfer tax to the vendor instead of the purchaser is beyond me. But that's another policy consideration for the provincial government. Next slide. So back to the question of supply. So if my argument would be that it's really the demand side factors that have been the key determinants of rising home prices. We have seen a significant increase in supply already. 40% nationally, 58% in your region, and new supply is a very small part of the system. And I think we do tend in the media discussion to conflate the issue of supply as in new construction with the issue of supply as in the inventory of homes available for sale. And there has been constraints on the inventory of homes for sale as a result of folks not wanting to put the house on the market during COVID and have people come through the house and so on. And it's been the lack of listings as opposed to the lack of construction that has been a big issue. So supply there doesn't necessarily address that particular problem. So there's this notion that if we basically just upzone all of our single family yellow zones, and we'll create a whole bunch of additional supply, and we'll do intensification around transit areas, certainly would increase the total number of homes. But in many cases, and particularly we all have in our various cities, have areas that are very attractive. People want to live there. They're willing to pay a significant price to buy in there. If we basically take those areas and we allow 3 homes on that same lot, the new homes are not going to be sold at 1/3 of the price of the existing home. They're going to all be sold at the same price of the existing home, or slightly less in that it might be slightly smaller, but it's certainly not going to be significantly cheaper. I can walk around my neighborhood here in Ottawa and look at all the sort of 1960s, 1970s bungalows. They're looking a bit tired. They're priced around about $600,000-$700,000, reasonably affordable to a young professional couple trying to get into the market. Builders are buying those homes, knocking them down, building semi-detached homes, and selling each side for $1.4 million. So we just doubled our density. We also doubled our price. So yes, we need new supply, but if we're concerned about housing affordability, we have to think about the price of the stock that we're actually creating And is it possible to actually do anything to control that price, either creating incentives to build at lower prices, providing things like differential development charges based on the price and or size versus the number of bedrooms that's currently used, and putting some kind of constraint on both the price and the rents of the housing that we're actually creating. Next slide. And so looking at your region, as I mentioned, you've significantly increased your housing supply. It's largely been in the form of condo development. The burgundy colored middle part of the bar there is where most of the growth has happened. You've generally had reasonably good levels of rental construction in the Waterloo region, much better than the province as a whole. And for a number of years, you were around about 30% of starts were for rental, which is more or less the number of percentage of renters in the population. As opposed to the province as a whole, has only been about 15% in the last couple of years, up from about 5 or 6% for most of the 15 years from 2001 to 2015. So you've seen this significant increase in your starts, but look at your prices. Your prices have gone up just in the last 2 years, median home price. These are only single and semis. They don't include the condos because the data isn't readily available for CMHC. But the fact that we've significantly increased supply, prices have gone up. Builders going out today are looking at today's prices and saying, gee, if I build a house today, I can sell it for 800,000. So let's go get building. The fact that it may only cost them 600,000 to build it, they're not going to go and put it on the market at the low price. They're going to command the price that they think they can get in the marketplace. Prices are market based. They're not. So this notion that increasing supply, again, there is no evidence in the existing data, and I've done the same analysis here in Ottawa. We saw the same level, 60% increase in housing starts last year, same significant, in fact, even more, a significant increase in home prices here in Ottawa as well. Next slide. So basically, I would say that what we have, as I just suggested, is these new home high prices are very much baked into the market. People who were thinking of listing the home, they're listing them at today's values because they think they can get a great deal. If they can't get that, they're going to take it off the market. Meanwhile, we've got buyers that the fear of missing out are going ahead and purchasing homes at these excessive prices. Many of them are enabled to overbid by the fact that they have these bags of money from selling their existing home and or from their parents that sold their existing home, which is also helping them there as well. So then if we want to affect affordability, we need to address this excess quality of demand and ability to pay, not just add to supply, because supply alone, as we've seen in the data, will not actually address the affordability problem. Just next slide. Just to finish up, I wanted to switch to the other side of the market. Obviously, I've talked a lot about home prices, but housing rents or home rents are equally important, and in fact, probably more important from a government policy point of view. Because a lot of the folks that live in the rental market are lower income. The median income of renters are half those of owners, so the capacity to pay is there. And when we squeeze the rental market, it sort of filters down to the bottom end of the market, and the collateral damage there are those low-income folks who really can't find anything in their income band to be able to purchase. As I mentioned, migration has had a big impact on here. The effects of sort of constrained access to the home ownership market have had a significant impact. If we look at sort of historically, in Canada, we were bumping along on the home ownership rate at around about 63% for 25 years, from the mid-70s to 1996. Between 1996 and 2006, the percentage of homeowners went from just under 63, to 69%. That's 800,000 renters moved from being renters to being owners. That's the same as building 80,000 new rental units a year. The fact that we weren't building rental didn't matter because people were exiting the rental market, creating vacancies and allowing other folks in. We didn't see really dramatic drops in vacancy rates other than in a few cities, and we didn't see really dramatic increases in rents. Since 2015, because of high home prices, but exacerbated by public policy, the federal government has instituted 21 different initiatives of macro-prudential policy change to constrain access to credit to try and manage what they call the economic fiscal stability. They're worried about the broader economy and what happens if we have a slowdown or a collapse in house prices, how will it affect the economy. and they're actually interested in propping up home prices more than they are having them come down to address the affordability issue. The consequence of that is that young households constrained to get into the home ownership market stay in the rental market. If they stay in the rental market, vacancy rates go down, rents go up, and poor people get hurt. So the policy choices we're making in the home ownership side of the market very much have a significant impact on the rental sector. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, we have seen a slight increase in the proportion of rental construction in Ontario. The dotted line is the percentage of all housing that's rental, and we can see through the pretty well the mid-90s to 2015, it was less than 10%, 5 or 6% of new starts were for rental, even though 1/3 of us rent. But for the reason I just mentioned, that didn't have a dramatic effect because vacancies were being created by folks moving into home ownership. That process has slowed down, but we're still not building enough rental housing. Canada's doing better. The rest of Canada is doing much better than Ontario. In the rest of the country, this dotted line is now up to 32% in the last 3 or 4 years, and we've quadrupled the level of new rental construction across the country. Ontario hasn't been a contributor to that particular increase. Next slide. Back to migration. Migration is really important. I mean, certainly, building new rental can affect vacancy rates, but because people are arriving so quickly, it's really migration that is impacting. And this is almost a mirror image in this chart. We see as the red line are the vacancy rates, and the blue line is net migration. So this could be it's provincial level, so it's interprovincial as well as international migration. When migration goes down, vacancy rates go up. Conversely, when migration goes up, the vacancy rates go down. So we've seen that in the very recent period. Of course, 2020, 2021 with COVID, obviously we had the closing of the border and the end of migration. But if we chart at 2019, what was the trajectory of that at that point in time if we continued to have those levels of immigration, and if we actually, as the budget suggested, federal budget, we continue to have a very high level of international immigration, we will continue to see significant pressure on those vacancies and vacancy rates going down. Next slide. And the consequence of low vacancy rates are very significant increase in rents. This is actually data for your region, and you can see the vacancy rate is bumped along. It's just below for the last decade 3%, which is sort of generally considered a healthy vacancy rate. But we see in the last four or 5 years, rent increases, year-to-year rent increases in excess of 5%. That's in a province where we have a rent guideline of roughly 2.1% for a number of those years. And then last year, of course, a moratorium on rent increases. So how can we have rents going up when we have rent regulation in place? Well, 18 to 20% of homes, I couldn't see the exact data in your region, but across the province, that's the ratio, of rental homes turn over every year. And as a result of vacancy decontrol, we're seeing those decontrolled units, the rents are going up to 18, 20%. And they're actually weighting up the overall average increase. So we've had, the existing stock is getting increasingly more unaffordable, less affordable, I guess would be the correct way to put it. The strange thing here is in 2020, 2021, we continued to see a very significant increase in the rent level, despite the fact that we had much less migration and we had, the vacancy rate that didn't go down, but the rent certainly still went up. So there's obviously a lot of folks there with capacity to pay, so those units turn over that are driving up rents. And of course, the number of units available to low-income folks is getting increasingly squeezed. Next slide. We'll come back to that point in the next slide. What this slide shows us is, again, we are seeing an increase in rental construction. This is looking at all cities across Ontario, and it compares for the CMHC rental survey. It's a special data request that I asked them to do for me, where I compared the rents of units that were completed prior to 2016 and those completed since 2016. And what we're seeing generally across the province is that the newly completed rental units are renting as high as 165% of the average market rent in London and Ottawa. In your region, they're around about just over 150% of the average market rent. and then it drops down in some communities, but still significantly above the older units. Again, new supply. We're getting lots of new supply, increasing levels of new supply, but at much higher rents that really isn't helping us address the affordability problem, particularly the affordability problem of those in the greatest need. Next slide. And this is actually the most scary piece of information, and we don't have the data yet for 2021 because the census data on housing and housing costs won't come out until September. But this is looking at data from 2011 to 2016, and across the country, we lost 322,000 units renting below $750 a month. That's the rent level that someone with an income of $30,000 or less can afford. And we're massively eroding. During that particular period of time, the federal provincial programs that were in place that you guys were delivering in the Waterloo region, the investment in affordable housing, across the province, across the country, for every new home that was funded under that particular program, we were losing 4 as a result of this erosion of the existing lower rent stock. Now, it's eroding for 2 reasons. One is it's actually being physically knocked down and demolished. And again, while the policy of intensification is a sound policy from the point of environmental concerns and making better use of resources, we had a very significant rental construction boom in the 60s and 70s when the baby boomers were all growing up and leaving the family home. And a lot of those rental apartments were built in the older inner city areas. And as we intensify, we knock down the 3-4 story walk-ups and we put up higher density buildings, but we lose the affordable housing stock. In the absence of a rental replacement bylaw, that stock is absolutely lost. And the right-hand chart here, the red bars are showing the change in the CMHC surveyed stock in terms of the absolute loss of units over in the province of Ontario. The bigger concern, however, is this increasing phenomenon of financialization, wherein large capital firms and REITs are kind of kicked out of this, but I think there's a lot of other folks in addition to REITs, including small investors, are doing it as well. They're taking advantage of what I mentioned before, vacancy decontrol, and they're basically buying up buildings that are at moderate rents now. And when the units turn over, they're significantly increasing the rents. In some more predatory cases, there are some property or capital funds and property owners that are using deliberate strategies of renovictions to get existing tenants out so they can exercise the vacancy decontrol mechanism. And this is having a massive effect on removing so these units still exist physically, but they exist at much higher rents as a result of this process of trying to extract much higher yields. And we've turned from having small mom and pop investors who are relatively benevolent landlords and put up the rents to cover their costs, but not dramatically. They knew the tenants, there was a personal relationship. We now have this anonymous group of investors in what's now identified as a very valuable asset class, multi-residential rental investments, and we've massively commodified housing. It's no longer a home. It's now an investment vehicle for completely anonymous investors generating yield with a very, very serious negative impact in terms of our ability to meet affordable housing needs. And as I say, we're massively losing. The National Housing Strategy is currently proposing to build about 160,000 homes over 10 years. If we compare that, if this trend we saw from 2011 to 2016 continues, the effect of the National Housing Strategy will be to lose 15 homes for every new one it actually funds. So we'll have increasing issues of rental affordability. Next slide. So just to wrap up, obviously, my key point here is that if we really want to address the issue of housing affordability, we have to much more prescriptively and carefully analyze what's the nature of the problem. The simplistic notion that if we just build more supply, we'll address the affordability issue, I think is completely incorrect and won't actually create that outcome. That said, I do agree we need supply, and certainly in a rapidly growing region such as yours, we absolutely need to create more supply. But simply any supply is not good enough. We have to be more prescriptive and surgical about ensuring that we're creating missing middle type units, moderately priced rental, entry-level home ownership type of opportunities for the folks that are coming in. On the immigration side, these 451,000, I don't know why they didn't round it off to 450, but anyway, The 451,000 expected new permanent residents through immigration, are we talking here economic class, high-tech workers that are coming in to work in your high-tech industry, in which case afford a reasonably high-priced home? Are we talking about refugees from places like the Ukraine and other parts of the world? Are we talking foreign students? So knowing the nature of that growth, I think it's in terms of you thinking about your growth strategy as well. And as I mentioned, it's the type of units and the rents and costs of those units, I think, is a consideration, and to what extent you've got transit systems there, the GO train and your light rail system. You have opportunities for intensification around transit sites. Can we ensure that there are policies in the official plan to identify inclusionary zoning opportunities? And certainly, as planners, it's the planners that actually set land prices, and municipal councils that approve plans. As soon as a piece of land has no inherent value until you, as a council, approve that the use on that particular piece of land. And if you increase the density, you increase the potential profit and you increase the underlying value of the land. So in terms of addressing affordability, setting criteria that actually confiscate some of that surplus profit from development by saying, we're going to actually reduce your potential profit by requiring you to accept lower prices or include a percentage of units at affordable rents. The developers will do the math and they'll figure out they can't afford to pay as much as the land, and you'll suppress land price increases. So thinking about how the planning process actually impacts the market and how the official plan sends signals to the market about potential uplift in land values is a really critical part as you start thinking about how the official plan fits into some of these issues of housing affordability.
Steve,
that's it for me. Thank you.
Councillor Davies, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pomeroy, for your presentation. I found it very interesting. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to keep it to a couple because I want to be cognizant of council's time. But my first question is, you're certainly minimizing, I would say, the supply issue. And I would just ask, and I agree that comparison to G7 probably isn't the greatest, but in that same report, they even said I recall the number, within Canada, there was a deficit in Ontario, even comparing Ontario with the rest of Canada, there's a deficit of about 600,000 homes just to reach the rest of the Canadian average. And for some perspective for the rest of committee, my napkin math tells me that's the population of Hamilton, the number of homes in Hamilton twice. So it's great that we're doing more now and meeting, but what's your comment in terms of meeting that deficit that we already have?
Yeah, I would question that statistic as well in terms of the deficit. Again, when the census data came, we saw that across the country, that the census reports the total number of dwellings and the total number of dwellings occupied by the usual resident. The difference between those two numbers is 1.3 million dwellings in Canada. 8% of our entire stock is the difference. So if we have that level of vacancy in the existing stock, you would expect that if we had an absolute shortage of housing, that over time that difference would actually have declined substantially. It was the same number, 8% in 2016. So we would, just like we do in the rental market, and we saw there in the rental vacancy rates, when there's increase in demand, the vacancy rate goes down. We haven't tended to see that happen as much in the overall housing stock. Now, whether that's because some of those units are vacation properties, they're Airbnb type properties, that type of thing, I'm guessing not too many people are buying homes in the Waterloo region as a vacation home. Airbnb may be a factor, but I think there is, I would question that the analysis that came up with that shortfall. I don't think it's correct.
Okay, so the data itself. Okay, and the next question, I believe you used the number of people living in a home being greater in Canada to other countries in the world as a rationale for lower supply. Now, is there any data? I only know anecdotally of people in their 20s and even early 30s living in their parents' basement that want to purchase a home but can't afford it. Do you have any information on that? Can you figure?
Yeah, you're right. There is a bit of a cart and horse issue here. Is the fact that we have more people per home because there aren't enough homes, or is it because that's the way we've been? I mean, this has been a long-standing. We've traditionally had larger household sizes. We are actually coming down from about 2.51 to about 2.41 in the last decade. So it is declining, and certainly when we see the kind of housing stock we're building, a lot more condos, one and two bedroom units, we would expect to see the average household size over time come down lower. So that is to some extent an element, but again, it hasn't changed dramatically. Then the fact that house prices have gone up so much. I mean, folks have been living in their parents' basement for decades. Yes, people are young individuals are staying longer in the family home. There's other phenomena there, increasing supply if they can afford it. So again, it's a question of, is it just enough? Or is it because they can't afford a house or their own house outside of the family home that's causing them to stay there? And if we're just actually adding supply, that won't necessarily enable them to move out.
Okay, two more quick questions, if I could. So I agree with all the other factors that you mentioned.
Okay.
My only concern is the supply. Can you be self-reflective for a second? And in terms of the experts in your field, where would you say the consensus is in terms of the supply? Or are you in the minority? Are you in the majority? I know you're obviously professional. I respect that, but I would appreciate it, just because we're taking your advices.
Fair enough. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think the larger number of commentators have actually bought into the argument that we have an insufficient supply problem. If we look at some of the chief economists of the banks, I think the Robert Kavik and I can't remember the other guy at Scotiabank are the same as me, that they think these statistics are misrepresented. Others like Jean-Francois Perrault and a few of the other National Bank economists do think there is a shortage of supply. So it's a mixed bag. I would say the slight majority are probably on the side of insufficient supply.
And last question, and I do appreciate the time, Chair Redmond.
Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, you're cutting out, Chair Redmond.
I'm happy to circle back to you. I've got 3 other speakers,
Oh,
so if you
apologies.
want to go on the
Okay,
list,
thank you.
I'm happy to come back to you. But Councillor Bonagor has a question, so go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Steve, thank you so much for all that information. I have a really quick question. I'm just wondering if you've seen, what are the most promising tools you've seen for municipalities that either exist or are emerging in Canada or around the world for areas that are grappling with all of this stuff?
That's an easy question, long answer. There is no easy answer. I mean, obviously, if there was, we would have figured it out by now. And the housing system is a very complex and interrelated system. It's still my sort of story there about the constraints on home ownership reverberating back into the rental sector. I think certain parts of the same issues exist in many cities. Some of the U.S. cities haven't seen a significant increase in house prices, but they tend to be that are renowned for sprawl, so they're just spreading out. A lot of the southern U.S. cities, for example, where they've got very cheap labor, lots of land, and sprawl as a policy, are more successful in managing the issue of affordability, and that's why it's such a vexing question for us, because we are trying to be responsible in terms of managing growth, utilizing our resources efficiently, not using up land excessively, trying to achieve that balance between intensification and addressing affordability. I don't think anybody's got it right. I think many cities are all struggling with it. We've seen in the last week with the City of Victoria, the City of Saanich have now approved policies to accelerate development specifically for affordable housing as opposed to all building permits. And so if the issue is on the affordable side, perhaps that's a policy that could have some impact.
Councillor Bonagor, do you have a second question?
Thank you. I'll pass it on to the next person. Thanks.
Thank you. Colleagues, I took my mask off and I'm farther away from the mic. Hopefully that's going to cut down on the static. Councillor Henry, go ahead. You have a question?
Yes, Chair Edmund, and thanks for the presentation. I won't go through my first few questions, which Councillor Davies sort of went through on the supply side. I I do still have some caution on that. But I want to get at the comments you're making around sort of the intensification policies and the intersection of that with affordability. Certainly, we have more than one thing we're trying to do in terms of planning here, and climate is in effect, how and where we grow, the cost of servicing infrastructure, the fact that we have hundreds of thousands more people to accommodate, and where do we accommodate them. The draft sort of housing policies the region sort of released for comment so far have spoken to sort of demolition aspects and trying to not lose stock in that respect, condominium conversions and trying to manage stock in that effect. So I think there's some policies coming forward to deal with those that I think are quite helpful. But I wanted to sort of drill down on sort of that intensification in the so-called yellow belt. And your example was taking a detached, bungalow and turning it into two semis. I think there's been a range of conversations at the province and in other places around a number of different kinds of forms of housing. Our own analysis on affordability inside the region today is showing singles, semis, and even towns now aren't affordable to most residents, but forms denser than that kind are. So can you sort of drill into that for a moment? If we're thinking about how we manage intensification while thinking about affordability in terms of those areas, what should we be thinking about in terms of forms and helping us achieve the other objectives and at least not hurting this objective? Maybe helping, but at least not hurting objectives around affordability.
Yeah. The policies have to be quite careful in terms of doing that kind of stuff, because, as I say, simply allowing higher density, the market will float to the best price it can get on that new density. Certain built forms, I mean, if you're talking maybe, if I look up my backyard, I can see a property that had a detached home on it until last year. They're now building a sixplex. So maybe that, a slight increase, that sort of gentle density, rather than just one or two units, going up to slightly larger. I think we also have the issue of, across the country, of our 16 million homes, we have 4 million homes with 3 or more bedrooms occupied by 1 or 2 people. So we've got a lot of excess bedrooms, and perhaps some of those sort of seniors that want to remain in the community, their social networks there, their families there. If we were creating sort of housing options for them to actually downsize and making their lot then available for redevelopment, because that's the other challenge. We can rezone it, but if people are still living in those homes, getting access to the lot to be able to knock it down and rebuild is a challenge as well. So creating sort of positive opportunities for folks to relocate in the area. And I think, using mechanisms like, as I mentioned, sort of, reviewing your development charge bylaw, and can you actually use the development charges, which the industry complains excessively about, that they're too high, that, perhaps one happy medium there is to say, okay, well, we'll reduce the development charges, but only if you build below this size or below this price, and we'll raise the development charges for bigger, 3,000 square foot, 4-bedroom homes kind of stuff. So as I say, these are not easy issues to grapple with. I think trying to figure out, if you are going to increase the density, I would say I wouldn't just do it as of right. You can build whatever you want. There has to be some conditionality into it, and that conditionality has to reflect the kind of outcomes you want to create as a community.
Councillor Henry.
Okay, now and that's the one point I just want to sort of raise around the non-permanent resident and the rental construction rate. As sort of the ward councillor for the area where we've seen a lot of purpose-built student in substantial ways, I think the data you're seeing over the last decade of the high level of rental construction is significantly concentrated in sort of that purpose-built student rental product that we're seeing. And in terms of the occupied by not the usual resident, I can see them at my window. So I think that's the international student, migration piece, I think should factor into your thinking around when you're looking at that 8% number. And it's not just vacation properties and Airbnbs. Anyways, I turn it back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Bodley, do you have a question?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Pomeroy. I appreciate the presentation. And I too had some comments or questions around the supply sort of piece as not as the answer, but as a part of the answer. But I think Councillor Henry and Councillor Davey have sort of touched mostly on those. The thing that I guess I wanted to bring up is something that's resonated with me over the last few weeks. We received at our council's presentations from the CEO of Communitech, which is one of the largest organizations driving tech businesses in the region. And he's come to us, he's the new CEO, come to us from Silicon Valley, and brings with him some sort of cautionary tales around what happened from a housing perspective and affordability perspective in Silicon Valley, with the one thing that he is cautioning us about being that we're looking at a period of exponential growth or potential exponential growth here in the region of Waterloo with respect to tech businesses, jobs, employees, and cautioning us that municipalities are perhaps better served when it comes to incremental growth and not so much on the exponential growth side of things. So I wonder if you had any comments about whether there's any indication that perhaps we may be in a period of exponential growth here in the region of Waterloo that makes us unique and different from some of the other municipalities in Ontario and across the country, that may necessitate us thinking about our supply policies in a slightly different way. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm not entirely familiar with the region, but I am aware of the fact that you do have quite a high tech component down there in your labor market. And I think the cautionary piece there would really be that those jobs tend to be well paying. You've got folks who have capacity to pay, so the kind of folks I talked about in those earlier charts, and they have quite strong capacity, especially if they're selling out of San Francisco or the Silicon Valley. To bring a lot of equity with them and significantly drive up your home prices. I think from a healthy labor market and a healthy residential market perspective, you still need a significant number of essential workers who are not in the high-tech industry but are key to your community, the folks that work, the clerks in the stores, the folks that, teachers, the so-called key worker categories, and trying to ensure that you actually create a supply of housing that's not just for the well-heeled, high-income, high-tech folks, but you are actually making sure that some portion of the supply is actually directed to the other sort of part of the labor market which doesn't have the same capacity to pay. Not easy to do, but being cognizant of the fact that they will get squeezed out if you don't try to either preserve existing affordability. It's probably easy to preserve existing affordability than it is to build new affordability, because you build at cost, and it's just not affordable to build these days. So thinking about the impacts on the existing market, do you in fact have a rental replacement bylaw for those older properties that are susceptible to being intensified? Those types of policies could probably help.
So, colleagues, I'm going to intervene, and I do this with apologies. We have a very important next chunk, which is dealing with the land need assessment and growth options. So, with your indulgence, I have Councillor Singh Chapman, and circling back to Councillor Davey, and I will take you as first questioners after we look at the land need assessment. But it's a very significant piece of this, and the growth options, and something that I think Mr. Pomeroy, thank you very much. You've been informative, insightful, and given us a lot of provocative thoughts. But colleagues, I am going to ask us to move on. So with thanks to Mr. Pomeroy, I would now turn the floor over. I don't know, Rod, do you want to introduce this? Or are we going right to Danielle, the Field's Director of Community Planning, to provide a summary of growth options?
I think we can go directly to Danielle.
All right. Thank you, Rod and Chair Redmond. Just a quick sound check, if I can get a thumbs up if everyone can hear me. Okay, thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about the assessment, or LNA, as I may refer to it this afternoon. Today, we're not going to get into detail on the methodology for the LNA, but instead focus on the results of the growth options contained within the assessment. And there's a lot more detailed information in the LNA that I'll go through with you today, and it's supported by a variety of technical studies that are available on our webpage. Next slide. So on this slide, we have a few key points to keep in mind as you go through the land needs assessment document. The first is that all options provide for growth. All municipalities will be allocated additional people and jobs, and how much depends on the growth option that's chosen. Second, the land needs assessment only determines how much land we may need in order to accommodate forecasted population and jobs. It doesn't make a determination of the specific locations. The specific locations and associated mapping of any potential expansion will be proposed through a recommendation report in June, as Rod mentioned previously, with an accompanying evaluation of these areas. And lastly, under all of the options presented today and in the land needs assessment document, an expansion will be necessary to accommodate forecasted employment growth. Next slide. So there's a few levers that guide growth and the growth options, including things like intensification rate and density target. And these result in varying housing mixes and land needs. So I'll spend a little bit of time before we go into the options, walking you through some of the terms on the slide. Starting on the right-hand side of the screen, within the land needs assessment methodology, there's two sets of calculations. One is for employment area and one is for community area. Employment area refers to lands for growth like business parks and industrial lands, and community areas are for population, commercial, and institutional growth. And where growth is directed within community areas are in the built-up area, which includes those areas within Waterloo region that are already developed, and in designated greenfield areas, or DGA, which includes undeveloped areas within Waterloo region that are planned for future growth. So moving down to the last two rows in the charts, there's two other terms that you'll hear throughout the rest of the presentation, and those are intensification rate and density target. Intensification rate refers to the percentage of new development that occurs within existing built-up area, and density target refers to the average number of people and jobs that live and work within a specific area, and in our case, it's people and jobs per hectare. Then if you move over to the left-hand side, you'll see definitions relating to housing mix. Low density is generally singles and semi-detached, medium is generally townhouses, and high is generally multi-unit or high-rise apartments. Next slide. So on the screen, you'll see a map of Waterloo region that shows the general regional structure. And we provided this map to you today for a really quick reference for some of the considerations that I'll go through for the different growth options. You'll note the countryside line in red, the protected countryside in green, and the purple areas which represent the urban areas in the region where growth should be directed. The growth options direct varying levels of growth to the purple areas, and depending on the option, if there's not enough land to accommodate growth, then there's a need to expand. Next slide. So when we talk about growth options, each option has a different intensification rate and density target, and this helps us determine how much land may be needed to accommodate future growth. There's 3 community area options and 2 employment area options in the land needs assessment that I'm going to go through with you today. The community area options represent first the minimum targets under the growth plan, which requires 50% of development occurring be directed into the built-up area, and a density of 50 people and jobs per hectare throughout the designated greenfield area. And then the second option targets intensification rates and DGA densities that are higher than the growth plan minimum targets, with some urban expansion from a community area perspective. Option 2 assumes a 60% intensification rate and 60 people and jobs per hectare. The higher targets are reflective of the development trends within Waterloo region and support a shift in current development patterns to a more compact transit-supportive built form. The third option has a 60% intensification rate and a 66 density target, and is based on public feedback to provide an option which is more ambitious and would not require an urban boundary expansion for community area lands. The employment options are based on achieving an increasing intensification target within existing employment areas. Option 1 assumes an intensification target of 15%, which is similar to current trends. And then based on public feedback, option 2 was developed to minimize the amount of additional employment lands which would be required. This option assumes a higher intensification rate of 25%. In addition to the two options on the screen, staff considered two additional growth options that assumed higher intensification rate and DGA density targets of 65% and 65 people and jobs per hectare, and 70% intensification and 70 people and jobs per hectare. Those options generate an excess amount of DGA lands currently designated in the region of approximately 600 hectares and 1,000 hectares respectively. Applying these targets would require the region to prohibit development on excess lands until the year 2051. And as a result, a full assessment of these options was not pursued in the land needs assessment. Next slide. This slide shows you visually how the employment and community options are connected. So starting at the top of the screen in the blue circles, you can see there's 3 community area growth options. And as you can see from left to right, there's increasing intensification and density targets across the options, which result in varying land needs. The land need is greatest under option 1 with the lowest intensification and density target, and the land need is lowest under option 3. The employment options are associated with the community area options. These two options generate the same employment area land need for the region as a whole and result in varying employment allocations by area municipality. And within the two options, there's 2 choices presented in the amount of employment growth estimated to be accommodated through intensification of the region's existing employment areas, as I went through on the previous slide. Next slide. So I'll take a little bit of time and walk you through first the community area options in a little bit more detail. Next slide. We'll start off with community area option 1. This is the option that uses the minimum targets under the growth plan, and it assumes a minimum intensification rate of 50% and a density target of 50. This option produces a land requirement of 2,208 hectares of land. The region has achieved 53% intensification in the built-up area from 2013 to 2019, and a DGA density of 54% as of 2019. Option 1 assumes targets that are below what we are currently achieving in terms of intensification and density. Under this option, an expansion would occur in most area municipalities, and this option results in the largest land requirement and would require going outside of the countryside line when we also take into account the employment area land need. So if you move into the middle of the screen, you'll note that in this option, we wouldn't be able to accommodate approximately 107,000 people in our existing DGA. And moving to the bottom of the screen, you'll see that we do need to accommodate about 121,000 housing units to 2051. And the pie chart on the bottom left shows our current housing mix as of 2021, which is 59% low density, 15% medium density, and 26% high density. The middle pie chart shows the growth in the housing mix to 2051. And then the pie chart on the bottom right shows housing mix at 2051, which for option 1 is 50% low density, 16% medium density, and 34% high density. Next slide. So we'll move on to community area option 2. Option 2 applies more ambitious intensification and density targets of 60% intensification and 60 people and jobs per hectare. The option produces a land requirement of 376 hectares. The option results in expansion in a few area municipalities, and it supports a shift in current development patterns to a more compact, transit-supportive built form and requires 83% less land area for expansion than option 1. Under option 2, the incremental housing forecast is anticipated to further shift to medium and high density at 19% low density, 26% medium density, 53% high density, and 3% secondary units. Then on the bottom right, you'll see the housing mix by 2051 with 45% low density, 19% medium density, and 36% high density. Next slide. So similar to option 2, option 3 is an intensification focused option, but also applies a higher density target of 66 people and jobs per hectare. This option results in no urban area boundary expansion from a community area land perspective. This option also supports a shift in current development patterns to a more compact, transit supportive built form with higher densities in all housing types in the designated greenfield area. To achieve the targets under option 3, an incremental housing forecast by type is anticipated to further shift to medium and high density with 18% low density, 26% medium density, 54% high density, and 3% secondary units. Next slide. So I'm not going to go through all of the numbers on this slide, but the next 2 slides do provide a breakdown of the 3 community area options and what they mean for each area municipality. You'll note that there's population allocated to all municipalities under all options. Next slide. This map shows additional community area land needs across municipalities. Option 1 requires the greatest amount of additional lands to accommodate the forecasted growth. The largest expansion occurs in Cambridge and Woolwich. Under option 2, there is a smaller need for additional lands. And the majority of lands have been allocated to Cambridge and Woolwich, with a small provision of additional lands to North Dumfries and Wellesley. The quantum of the lands that have been allocated allow for the new lands to be developed as complete communities. It's difficult to develop smaller, fragmented parcels of land into complete communities, so the allocations take this into account. Under option 3, no additional community area land would be required, so no additional lands have been allocated to any of the municipalities from a community area perspective. Next slide. So we'll now take a bit of a closer look into the employment area options. Next slide. The employment options are associated with the community area options. The 2 options generate the same amount of employment area land need for the region as a whole and result in varying employment land allocations by area municipality. Within the 2 options, there's 2 choices presented in the amount of employment growth estimated to be accommodated through intensification of the region's existing employment areas of 15% and 25%. On the middle left of the slide, you'll see employment option 1 below community option 1 with 2 choices of intensification of existing employment lands. And the second employment option is associated with community option 2 and 3. The employment area options differ in the allocation of additional employment lands as a result of the amount of community lands that are required under option 1. Next slide. So on this slide, it shows the allocation of total employment to each area municipality. This includes employment such as population-related employment, office, and employment lands employment. That one's a mouthful. One of the key considerations when allocating employment was to ensure that an appropriate amount of employment is allocated to each area municipality, aligned with forecasted population growth. This ensures that as each community grows, they can develop into complete communities, as well as have the ability to complete existing communities, and allows residents to live, work, and play within their communities. Intensification opportunities have been identified within the 3 cities, as well as Woolwich, as the largest share of existing employment lands, and the market demand is greatest in those municipalities. Next slide. So similar to the maps provided for community area growth options, this map provides the breakdown of the employment land allocations under the various employment growth options. The majority of employment lands have been allocated to Woolwich and Cambridge, as those locations have the greatest market demand for additional employment lands. It should also be noted that under community area option 1, given the amount of land required for community area growth within Cambridge, there's limited amount available of land for employment growth. So more lands have been allocated to Woolwich. For community area options which require less land, more employment lands have been allocated to Cambridge due to the strong market demand for employment lands in Cambridge. Next slide. So that's quite a lot of information in terms of the growth options themselves, and the growth options will have implications for how people will live and work in Waterloo region in the future. And this brings us to the question of how will all the different options be evaluated? How will we get feedback on which growth option best aligns with the community's vision for Waterloo region? Leading up to June, we'll be evaluating each option using the criteria that are on the slide. And they're organized under 6 themes. They include growth management, transportation infrastructure and financial impacts, agriculture and mineral aggregate resources, natural environment and source water protection, livability, and economic growth. We'll also assess the financial implications of each option and take a look at how these options work towards meeting our goals relating to greenhouse gas reductions. And after we've assessed the options based on these themes, work collaboratively with our area municipal colleagues throughout the process and listen to stakeholder and public feedback, we'll make a recommendation on the growth options. And at that time, mapping will also be available, showing more specific locations for potential expansion. Next slide. We look forward to continuing to engaging on the growth options. So we'll take a look at really high level, preliminarily, what we've heard so far, and then recap the next steps that Rod went through at the beginning of the presentation. Next slide. We've held 2 public engagement sessions over the past 2 weeks on the land needs assessment. And the questions that we've been asking throughout the sessions, as well as through our Engage platform, are listed on the screen. Through these sessions, we've had the opportunity to hear some preliminary feedback on the options. Next slide. And gathering this input into the growth options is really important given their impact on the future to our communities. At the 2 public engagement sessions, we had a combined registration of over 100 people, and it provided the opportunity to have some really thoughtful conversations. We also have a survey on our Engage platform with discussion questions from the previous slide, where we are receiving submissions on a daily basis, and that is open till the end of May. In addition, we've been meeting frequently with our area municipal colleagues and a variety of different stakeholders. So overall, some of the preliminary high-level feedback we received suggests a general understanding of the kind of community people do want to see in the future. And this relates to having conversations around climate action, protection of agricultural lands and natural resources, and ensuring a range and mix of housing. We've received opinions of support and considerations for all growth options, as well as requests for consideration of additional growth options. We've received feedback for consideration of additional growth options that would assume various combinations of densities and intensification rates. Based on these discussions, there may be further refinements to the growth options. We'll provide a fulsome report on what we hear through engagement when we come back in June. The report will synthesize what we've heard through the public engagement sessions, the upcoming public input session in May, as well as the submissions received. Next slide. Rod went through this at the beginning of the presentation, but as a reminder, before we shift into any of the questions of clarification, I have the next steps listed on the screen. On May 18th, there'll be a special public input meeting where members of the public and stakeholders can provide their input into the land needs assessment at a special planning and works committee. Following that, our feedback deadline for the draft land needs assessment and growth options is May 27th. This will allow us enough time to prepare for the upcoming June reports. In June, we'll be bringing forward 2 reports. The first will be a recommendation report on the growth options, and the second will be an information report on the release of the draft regional official plan amendment that will be focused on growth-related policies and mapping. We'll then be moving into the summer months targeting adoption of the amendment in August, and the process will have a public engagement sessions as well as a statutory public participation process. Thank you for taking the time to walk through the different growth options and the land needs assessment with us today. We appreciate the time that you've taken to join us. Next slide. So I'll hand it back to Chair Redmond, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
So Danielle, I just really want to thank you for being clear, focused, and speedy in going through a very important piece. I know Regional Council spent a lot of time talking about the land needs assessment, so thank you for this. Councillor Singh, I have you up first. Do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Fields, I think you've laid out a fairly good strategy and outline as to the public consultation and, of course, the different options and what that would lead in direction for growth. My question was, and I was glad to see that environment will be a key factor as to our region's commitment to sustainability. But additionally, what consideration will be taken towards future planning, towards efficiencies of technology, aspect of district energy, if we have certain type of density growth that can better leverage on those new avenues into the future.
So Danielle, do you want to take that, or Rod, who wants to field that question? Pardon the pun.
Danielle, you can take that.
Yeah. So we do have a variety of, through the chair, different considerations when we are evaluating the growth options, which, as you mentioned, do include natural environment, as well as an assessment from more of a climate change, energy reductions perspective. And as you'll note, there are a variety of different considerations in terms of the densities and intensification targets, not only from the community area perspective, but also from the employment perspective, which are on the table. I don't know, Brenna or Patty, if you maybe want to dive into that a little bit deeper in terms of the criteria and then some of what we've taken into account getting to where we are today.
So I see Patty's
Sure, Danielle, I'd be happy just to add a few more details. Our evaluation criteria, there's 27 distinct measures under each of the 6 themes. There is a very specific measure that tries to get at flexibility, and it asks us to assess how well an option can adapt to the uncertainties around demographics, economic conditions, extreme weather events, and advances in technology, including transportation and aspects of climate change. So it doesn't directly get at district energy, but there's a way for us to sort of differentiate between the different options to see if there's a difference that makes a difference.
Thank you. And so my reference to district energy was just one point, but it's clear to say that staff have that as foremost point in their consideration. So what I'm hearing is that increased consideration will be taken towards the environment. And please correct me if I'm wrong. And the last question I have is more towards density. In my own personal perspective, I think regionally we need to absolutely lead the national average, if not even the provincial averages, rather than try to follow or meet bare minimums. Where, based on the options, where do we follow comparatively? And that's my last question. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Singh. Who would like to take this question?
I think, I'd just like to offer, first of all, to Councillor Singh that I think the region is doing an outstanding job of driving urban intensification and higher densities for mid-sized metropolitan area. The impact of policy decisions as well as the investment in ION LRT have really paid dividends in this regard. There are some gaps in the inventory that we hope to be able to encourage the market to fill more aggressively, including medium density and missing middle housing, which is definitely not coming along at the same rate as our high rise and lower density products. But Brenna may choose to add some additional detail to where we stand in terms of densities across Ontario.
Thanks, Rod, and through you, Chair Redmond. Every municipality in the Greater Golden Horseshoe is undertaking a similar exercise, and some are further along than the region of Waterloo. But what we're seeing, of course, as they're developing their land needs assessment and releasing this, similar growth options, I would say quite confidently that we are ahead of the pack, particularly in our second and third option there. We're already achieving well over the minimums at 54 people per hectare, and we're looking to achieve greater density in our designated greenfield areas.
Thank you, Brenna. Councillor Chapman, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, staff, and also Mr. Pomeroy is still here for these presentations. So my question actually ties into Mr. Pomeroy's analysis, and I'd like to know how his analysis fits into the analysis and proposal that the region is presenting here. And what I'm thinking of in particular, I mean, it's great to see the climate change lens that's being used. What about the equity lens and the affordability lens? How are we going to tie that into the official plan?
So who would like to take this question?
Well, I would perhaps direct the first part of that question to Mr. Pomeroy because I think it relates to his observations about our analysis. Although I'm not sure to what extent he's gone through the details of our land needs assessment and official plan amendments. I would say, with regard to the second part of the question, that we're pretty excited about the housing policy recommendations that we put forward in the draft amendments. I guess what we call Chapter 2 of the Regional Official Plan Amendment. They're proposing some fairly significant innovations in order to support particularly middle family-oriented type housing in higher density settings in transit-oriented locations, building complete communities, transit-oriented communities, all of which serve to support increasing accessibility of our communities to people who have lower incomes and might struggle. We know that building complete communities and providing transit-oriented development makes it easier for people to manage inside of an urban place like the Waterloo region. With accessible employment, reduces costs of transportation and that sort of thing.
Steve, did you want to add something to the answer?
So perhaps over to you, Steve.
Yeah, I actually haven't looked at your regional growth, so I don't know the extent to which it has actually, taken that lens and utilized that information. So I would just defer back to the regional staff to, now that they've heard me talk about it, they can think, have they in fact covered it off, and is the need to do a bit more work in that area.
Councillor Chapman, did you have a?
I would say that our analysis is not significantly different from Mr. Pomeroy's. We've certainly seen similar trends. We've seen very significant growth in inventory. We've been monitoring closely the nature of population growth in the region, and the way that housing building permits and housing starts have fit or not fit that evolution of the housing market. So. I think our views would be pretty well aligned in terms of the way that supply and demand are evolving in the Waterloo region.
Sorry, Councillor Chapman, did you have a second question?
No, I'll leave it at that because I see there are other people that want to ask a question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, colleagues, I have 3 more speakers and we have about 12 minutes. So I'm going to go to Councillor Marsh and then to Councillor Davey and Councillor Henry because you already asked a question and Councillor Marsh hasn't. So, Sarah, go ahead. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you. I am just wondering about the word target. For me, it seems like more of an aspirational word, but I'm trying to understand what's the purpose of our minimum targets if we have already exceeded minimum targets in at least 2 of the growth scenarios. So can you help me understand the purpose of your minimum targets?
Who would like to respond?
Well, I can take a shot of that. Danielle may wish to add some additional detail. Certainly, the 50% intensification and 50 persons and jobs per hectare target is the minimum standard required by the province. So we use that as a baseline. As you indicated, right now we're well exceeding those figures, and we expect to continue to do that. The question is, how will our market continue to evolve over time? And as you can see from our data, the location of housing starts and the nature of the housing starts fluctuates quite significantly. In years past, we haven't had nearly the level of high density housing that we have had in the last several years. We also know that there's a need for a different type of housing mix. Like right now we're seeing low density, the concentrations in low density and very high densities. So really we need to see a broader mix of housing. And the question is how will that emerge over the course of the next 30 years? We do expect business cycles and cycles in population growth and demand for housing to move up and down over the course of the next 30 years. So we view the targets as longer term moving targets that we will achieve. And some years we could definitely overachieve them. Some years they might be tougher to meet.
Okay, and just as a follow-up question, other than some landowners and their advocates, have you heard from the community in all of the consultation that you've done, any kind of an appetite for expanding the countryside line?
I'll ask Danielle or one of our team to summarize thoughts on the countryside line coming in through our engagement process.
Danielle?
Thank you, Rod. And why don't I start, and then I'll ask Brenna maybe to supplement some of the more specific feedback. So we've had some really great conversations with a variety of different stakeholders through the sessions today as well. Sorry, this past few weeks, not today, as well as through submissions through the website, et cetera. And there's been quite a lot of dialogue around protection of agricultural lands, natural environment, and some questions around, under the different concepts, what does that mean in terms of the countryside line? As I mentioned, under community area concept 1, when you take into account the employment area needs as well, it would an expansion past the countryside line. So there has been some dialogue on that through these sessions so far. And I don't know, Brenna, if you maybe want to supplement that with anything more specific.
No, you're pretty much right about that, Danielle. We're hearing a variety of ideas, generally around, how shall we best accommodate this growing population and its changing demographics, and what type of housing need does that look like, and where is it best accommodated? So directly, we haven't heard people say, absolutely, I'm for option 1, nor have we said, have we heard, it's the worst option or something like that at this point in time. It's really creating that balance and hearing feedback from the community on how best to grow this region.
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. Councillor Davey?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My only remaining question, and I'm not sure if it's for Mr. Pomeroy, but just when we're deciding on these issues, I'm just curious because supply seems to be a key part of this discussion. And my question is, what is the risk, supposing that the pro-supply people are correct or the anti-supply people are correct? What is the risk and what would the outcome be of oversupply?
Who would like to take that one?
I think it would be great for Mr. Pomeroy to chew on that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think getting as we saw from some of the charts there, you don't when you're doing your projections, you tend to project on a very linear basis. But the reality is that both housing starts and population change are very jumpy. So you're always going to be a little bit out of sync at different times. And as we saw in the 2017-2019 period, that surge in population didn't immediately evoke a supply response. So you will have to sort of run through those sort of disconnects. The risk of having too much land, too much supply, the industry is pretty smart at figuring when to actually act. They will apply for a permit, but they will then sit on it. If they can't get bank financing for 60% of the sales on a condo, if they don't see the absorption potential being there, they won't start construction. So I think the industry and the market is quite good at moderating itself. And on the downside, it'll just slow down. The risk, I think, is more the other way, that you don't have enough zone land, you don't have enough land in the process to accommodate is in supply. I think that there is very little risk in having excess supply of land available if people are willing to take it up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for your patience, Councillor Davey. Councillor Henry, go ahead.
Thank you. I think I'll take the note from the earlier comments on flexibility as being something that is an assessment that will be done here, because I had a question around sort of employment land future casting. Given when we were here 5-10 years ago, the idea that industrial land would be basically gone and doubled in price and we wouldn't need incentives anymore seemed like crazy talk. But here we are, and this is where we're at. So there are some cycles that I'd expect over 30 years. And that's something I'm thinking about, and I hope staff are thinking about when we're sort of forecasting intensification rates and how much we need, that we don't presume current trends are just going to be current trends, that there's going to be some choppiness and more flexibility is better. On that line, I wanted to highlight and ask planning staff here, we're looking ahead to 2051, and what I heard in terms of options that were considered is that options 4 and 5 were dropped completely for further analysis because, well, we just weren't going to consider de-designating land. There's a lot more in the LNA about some sub-reasons for that, but at a high level, we're just not going to consider de-designating land. So once you designated it, it's designated forever. And so I have that as a caution in my mind around expansion and growth scenarios. That if we're going to come back to this in 10 years and do another one, and then 10 years and do another one, and we're still not at 2051, that there's a cautionary approach that is in my head around not over designating because we can never take it back, and then that sort of spreads how we think about growth rather than maybe a more compact form we're looking at. So can I ask staff to just sort of dig into that a little bit and tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking around that sort of sticky downwards and whether that's a factor in how we're considering these sort of three options?
So who would like to take that on? Rod, is that a question for you?
Yeah, sure. And then Danielle can supplement. Thank you for the question. This is a very real concern. We do know that based on planning decisions, as was mentioned by Mr. Pomeroy in his presentation, that once a decision made to expand the urban boundary and to designate land, that decisions are made regarding the future of that land, infrastructure planning is takes place, and so on. And so there's a significant ball that is put into motion once those decisions are made, albeit there's a lot of staging involved in land development processes that does take time, and lots of municipal decisions and private sector decisions that are made in sequence before land is actually brought to market and built on. And to that point, we right now have a very significant supply of land available, and is currently in the planning process or being prepared for development or in the development process. So I think your question also reinforces the importance of taking the approach or understanding the fact that we have to revisit the regional official planned land needs periodically over time, and we're obliged to review the plan from the point of view of land supply. Every 5 years, if it seems to be out of line, then we initiate a process. So there are opportunities to reconsider the analysis if market conditions have changed significantly or if community priorities have changed significantly. So I think all in all, the process, if we take a cautionary approach to moving forward, the process does allow us to adapt strategy over time. And, we are not casting this once and for all for the next 30 years. We're going to be revisiting this periodically with the community as the situation evolves.
Thank you. And thank you, Councillor Henry. Councillor Vrbanovich, we're going to squeeze you in at the tail end here. Do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Chair Redmond. And just very quickly, I have other questions, but I'll leave them for when we deal with this at the region. But one that I think is sort of relevant to both the municipal and the regional tier is, several of us have been holding on in terms of when we're going to provide input at the municipal tier into the regional process. And so just so that we all have clarity, since we're all on this call, are you looking for that input prior to the June 15th date, or are you looking for that input between June 15th and the summer date, so that we have that clarity?
Thanks for that question. Who would like to take that, Rod?
I think it would be great to get municipal input before June 15th, if at all possible. I know that our team is working hand in hand with the planning teams of the area municipalities right now. We expect to have a lot of conversation over the month of May, and it would be really helpful if municipalities intend to bring a formal request forward to the region, that information be brought before June 15th. Having said that, we will go through. We do have additional public engagement through the through July, as we were talking about, and the final amendment is not brought to council until August. And so we expect these conversations to continue right through the summer.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously there are the stakeholders at play on various viewpoints on the issue, but the municipalities have a different lens to it, and are tied in from a policy point of view with the region on this issue. So I think it's an important one that needs to be factored in. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all colleagues on the call and the ones that are here in the chamber. Thank Steve Pomeroy and all of the staff for a really good presentation. And this is not an ending, but a continuation of a discussion that's very important. Colleagues, I would just like to remind everyone that our next all council meetings are scheduled for Thursday, June 16th at 2022, and Wednesday, November 23rd in 2022, not at 2022. So thank you all for your attention and for the presentation, and I will now entertain a motion to adjourn, or I'm declaring us adjourned. You don't even have to move it, Les. So thank you all very much. Have a great weekend. Enjoy this fabulous weather. And again, thank you for this attention in this very important matter.